Hey there, welcome to The Pipeline. This is the Western Standard's weekly show we do live where we'll cover the top stories and analyze them among the top folks working here at the Western Standard. It's one of those rare times when we're all actually together in the same room for one of these. So I'm Corey Morgan, by the way, a podcast editor and columnist, and I'm flanked by our publisher, Derek Fildebrand.
Nice to social distance with you.
Yes, it's nice to get cozy. And Dave Naylor, our news editor, who just puts out that content.
Nice to have Derek back with us, isn't it?
Yeah, kind
I
of.
was only going, hey.
Has its moments. It's nice to collect like this.
I don't pay you enough to make you say nice things.
We'll get there. If I suddenly start being nice, I got a raise. So, and we've got a number of things to cover today. So Pastor Coates has finally been set free, and a number of charges against him have been dropped. The UCP is suddenly moving into their direct democracy promises. Well, suddenly, after 2 years. So we're looking at citizens initiative referenda and a recall legislation. And Jason Kenney has dealt with the push for his leadership review, perhaps. We'll see. It's quite a bit to unpack there. It's quite a lively week in the province. So as well, I mean, we can't do this. Just got to put that out there without our members. Be sure, if you haven't signed up already, get online and sign up. As I said, Dave puts out those fantastic stories. He's right on top of the news. We get exclusives, we get interviews, we get columns where I'll rant and rip a strip off people when they deserve it. Derek even gets a chance to write now and then still.
Not much anymore.
Well, but it's important to keep independent news going. I mean, the mainstream is just what it is these days, and we're filling that void, and we really appreciate that from the members. So get on in there and subscribe if you haven't already, and if you already have, thank you very much. We really do appreciate it. Another area that's helping us, of course, is direct sponsorship and advertisers from local businesses. And our sponsor for these digital shows has been Penny with Kyron's Way. And you can see the link down there, kyronsway.com. She's a local Calgary business. She's been sponsoring us for some time. If you got stress, if you got anxiety, and I think pretty much everybody does these days, Penny deals with it through counseling, dietary changes, just overall holistic health, because sometimes the prescription pad ends up getting used a lot too quickly for these sorts of things when perhaps things such as what Penny could offer us would be a much better solution. So be sure to click through. These sponsors are important. These are local businesses, support people. She might be offering just what you need or a family member needs in these crazy times. So let's get to crazy times. Somebody who's been pretty stressed lately has been, of course, Pastor Coates, his wife, his family. He's been incarcerated. Dave, it just came out today. Pastor Coates has finally been released, or he's about to be?
Well, about to be.
Yes.
Corey, breaking news this morning. The Crown has dropped all charges against Pastor Coates, except for one charge under the Public Health Act. His lawyers from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms say they expect to get him out very, very soon, possibly by Friday. As we all know, he's been in solitary confinement at the Edmonton Remand Center since he was arrested back on February 16th. In 2 bail appearances, he refused to abide by bail conditions that would have forbidden him to preach. Those decisions were sent to Court of Queen's Bench and were upheld. So pastor's been in jail all this time, solitary confinement. Daniel Smith did a great show with his wife a week or so ago that I encourage everybody to go and look at. And she talks about the stress that her husband's under. He's lost weight, suffering health problems and neck problems. Even without his absence, so Corey, the church has continued to operate, Grace Life Church, packed to the rafters every weekend. Every weekend the RCMP is outside, and every weekend the RCMP put out a release saying they were bad and they broke the law again, and that seems to be the end of it. And I'll just quickly mention, this seems to be a developing pattern with the Alberta Crown. They recently dropped charges against 4 separate people who were charged with, under not wearing the mask bylaw. So almost sort of seems to me like there may be a decision come down from above that we're not going to waste the court's time with this.
Yeah, or the internals came in. But Derek, so do you think the government is starting to get into a retreat mode with these restrictions, like trying to extricate themselves from these charges and mess that they've gotten into, or what's the strategy?
Well, one of our viewers has a really interesting point. The release of Pastor Coates from prison or jail here is coming very soon before his wife, Erin Coates, who they've mentioned was interviewed by Danielle Smith on the Western Standard. She is set to appear on Tucker Carlson on Fox News in the States. Tucker, for those who don't know, that is one of the most watched shows in America. This has been an international story. This isn't just Alberta. This isn't just Canada. This is becoming an international story that Canada is jailing pastors who refuse to stop preaching. There's different perspectives on that, but she is about to go on an international show and bring a really unflattering spotlight to the Alberta government for doing this. Government authority is kind of like government fiat paper money. It only exists if people believe it is worth something. And we saw with the restaurant rebellion in January, when small business restaurateurs were just opening up, saying, look, I'm either going to lose my business by not being open, or I'm going to lose my business by being fined to death. I prefer to go down fighting. The government had no choice but to bring in its phased reopening plan, which they tried to back out of, and then were forced by a caucus revolt and party revolt to actually follow through with. But the government is being dragged here towards reopening or not jailing people, kicking and screaming. They don't want to do it. They haven't real. This is a very interesting place for a government to be in. Normally government is obeyed without question in Canada. The only people not obeying government are generally outright criminals who are doing bad things for bad reasons. Most people don't openly defy the authority of the state. And what we've seen with the restaurant rebellion, with Pastor Coates at the Grace Life Church, they're not giving up. So they would arrest Pastor Coates, and he'd say, well, he didn't say what I would like to say here, because he's a pastor. He used cleaner language than someone like Corey.
He gave a holy middle finger.
He gave a holy middle finger to the state. And they eventually, I guess the government figured they had no choice but to actually hold him without bail in prison, in a maximum security prison in solitary confinement. The ultimate in social distancing is solitary confinement, which is only slightly worse than what the government's trying to enforce us to do over the last year. But he's not giving in. And when people refuse to give in to the power of the state on something like that, the government loses its power, because then you realize that the power of the government is really just as far as people believe it has the power. So the government is in full retreat on this. It's happening across the country, but it's particularly in Alberta, where I think there's a larger libertarian streak in people, where people have less respect for the unquestioned authority of the state. And so this has politically been very bad for Jason Kenney, in that he is not able to say, I fought to get us reopened. He won't be able to say that because he's being dragged there kicking and screaming the whole way, where the public is clearly ahead of the government in reopening without the government's consent every step of the way. And Pastor Coates, I think, has become a huge symbol of that.
Well, that's it. And the symbolism's important. I mean, the symbol of a religious person being locked up for preaching. I mean, I understand that the rationale is infection control, but I mean, this is things we've only ever imagined would happen in dictatorships and third world countries, and we do see it happen in those places. I mean, free religion is such an important and entrenched thing. I mean, some of our worst wars and oppression on people has been based on religious basis. So to see Alberta jailing, I mean, that's why it's caught the attention of, one of the top shows in North America. It's just unimaginable, and now the government's backing off. But I find it heartening in some ways. I appreciate the pastor not backing down. He dug his heels in. He's a man of faith. I mean, the bail conditions, he could have been out 2 weeks ago. All he had to do is say, I refuse to preach. But I mean, it brings, I don't want to invoke too high. I think it was like the Inquisition. As long as you promise not to do your actual faith, we'll let you free. Well, a person of true faith, I mean, they certainly weren't, hanging him by his thumbs or anything, but they're not going to say no. So they had to back off.
It's not a planned segment, but we got a really good question from Cheryl Dawn. She asked what our comments are in Jason Kenney's letter to Dr. Modry. Many of you all might remember Dr. Modry. He is a very famous and well-known doctor in Alberta. He performed, I think, the first open heart surgery or something. And he had been writing Kenney for months and months without getting any reply. sent his letters to the mainstream media. They ignored him. They refused to publish it. He brought it to us. He's a credible person, so we published his open letter. It was one of our most read articles of all time. So we Dave, you've interviewed Dr. Dennis Modry quite a few times. Just I think maybe yesterday or the night right before yesterday, Kenney finally actually released a response to this. It's quite a bit late, but I don't know. Maybe why don't you elaborate on what that response was?
Sure, Derek. The doctor wrote a in-depth letter back in December to Premier Kenney, who he thought was a personal friend. As mentioned, the story went viral, got covered around the world. Kenney remained silent until earlier this week, where he wrote a 2-page letter back to the doctor, basically saying, thank you for your concerns, but you're wrong. He said Dr. Modry's findings were based on incomplete factual data. He again pointed out how close Alberta ICUs came to being overrun before the province was put down and into lockdown. But again, I'll just bring up a story we did a couple of weeks ago, Derek, showing ICU hospitalizations actually dropped in 2020 compared to 2019. So, yeah, Kenney finally replied. He was dismissive of the doctor's arguments, said he's going to continue to work hard to protect Albertans. So, what do they say about statistics? You can turn them any which way you want.
Yeah, well, and it's shown that, again, that this is a government, and Jason Kenney's getting reactive. I mean, he's really suddenly being out there. He's being visible. He was kind of keeping a low profile and leaving it to Dr. Hinshaw and the health minister for quite a bit. And suddenly we're seeing Jason Kenney popping up everywhere, live videos, press conferences. They're changing tactic, which again tells us, well, that they know that their last tactics have been blowing up in their faces. So that letter is obviously, he felt undercut a lot of their initiatives, and he felt he had to personally respond to it.
Yeah.
So moving on then, to this government that is just having a terrible time, it seems, with just about everything they try to do. One of the key planks and promises during the mergers, it's one of the things that when I was the VP policy with the Wildrose Party, was direct democracy, citizens-initiated referenda, recall legislation. I mean, those were key points for us. Those were big with us. And we've assumed that was going to be what was coming in going forward. We were certainly told that in the last election. It was promised unequivocally that we were going to be getting these legislations. It somehow took 2 years to get there, but they finally have come somewhat. Dave, can you expand on that?
Yeah, the Premier likes to say promises made, promises kept. Well, this promise was made a long, long time ago, Corey, as you've said. So the government has introduced legislation where dissatisfied voters will be able to perhaps hold a recall vote on their representative. And it's not just provincial representatives, Corey, it's school board, it's civic officials, it runs the gamut. But I think, as you wrote, Corey, the standards that they've set are just seemingly incredibly high. Obviously, you don't want, one guy who's upset about something to be able to have the power to recall a candidate, but they've set it at 40% of voters in that riding. And how are you supposed to do that? It seems like an almost impossible task to me. So yeah, they've introduced the legislation, but whether it can be realistically achieved in the real world, I think remains up for debate.
Well, what do you think, Derek? Was it just a token thing to throw to the small C conservatives, libertarian, direct democracy people, or do they genuinely think this is good legislation?
Well, big surprise. I largely agree with your column that we just had up on the screen there. They promised they would do this. They had to. They came under renewed pressure to do it after the big Snowbird scandal right around New Year's. I thought a lot of people wanted the right to recall the representatives, and for some reason they didn't have the right to, even though they'd been promised they could. This should have been one of the very first promises they kept. This should have been one of their first pieces of legislation. This isn't some, very difficult to construct crown corporation like the Indigenous Opportunities Agency or whatever that's called, or all these other sorts of things that require a huge bureaucracy. We already had the model. They've already gone with the model of BC with a few important exceptions that we can talk about. There are examples in other jurisdictions right across the world, but most prominently British Columbia, which is what they said in their platform that they were going to follow, but they didn't do it. So now, let's assume this passes within a month or two. That might be a reasonable amount of time to expect a piece of legislation like this to wind its way through the pipeline, no pun intended, of the legislative process. So 40%, what people got to understand, it's not 40% of the number of people who voted in the last election. It's 40% of all eligible voters, which because in a provincial election, you've normally got between 50 and 60% of people voting. That means you need, on this petition, in almost all cases, more people signing the recall petition than actually voted in the entire constituency in the last election for all candidates and all parties combined, which is a pretty high bar to set. I think a better bar to set would be make it 50%, but of the number of people who actually voted in the constituency in the last election. So if 8,000 people voted in the last election in a constituency, you need 4,001. That gets you your recall. So a majority of those who actually took the time to vote. And it's very difficult. A lot of people don't understand how difficult it's going to be. This is not an online petition. If I put up an online petition tomorrow to rename Corey Morgan Doris Day, I could probably get 10,000 signatures. You know what? We should do that.
If we get enough subscribers, I'm willing to.
Yeah. Will you change your name if we can raise $10,000 for the Standard?
It's $10,000.
Okay, we'll set the bar
We'll
a little
negotiate
higher.
this a little later.
We'll set the bar a little higher. But online petitions are real easy. They're a dime a dozen. They're mostly data collection exercises. Spoiler. But these actual physical petitions, they are damn near impossible to do. You got to go house to house, especially for rural Albertans. What are the chances that someone's going to go canvassing farm to farm when it's a 10-minute? You have to hop their fence and walk 5 minutes down a big lane to get to their house. It's not happening. So rural people who live outside of the towns, they're never even going to get a chance to recall somebody effectively. And interestingly, they added a whole new step on top of what BC has. So even after you get the signatures for a recall petition, there's then a vote, essentially like a mini referendum in the constituency to decide if they want to recall. And chances are there'll be less people voting in that than actually sign the petition because of voter turnout. And then after you get 40% of the signatures to recall the politician, 40%, which you're probably not going to get. It's much more difficult than people think. Then you have a vote, and if you win that vote, then you have a by-election. And Dave's right, you're right. We should not have low bars for recalls. It shouldn't be about rehashing the last election. Your candidate didn't win, or your candidate was controversial. It should be for very exceptional cases. And so it should be a high bar, but they've set it ridiculously high. So now the UCP can turn to kind of its old Wild Rose base and say, hey, we gave you recall, promise made, promise kept, but dollars to donuts, an MLA could be found guilty of first-degree murder, and they're not going to get recalled.
Well, that's it. And we know that. Like, those of us who are insane enough to run for office had to actually go out, and you have to get like a formal petition, because I've seen a lot of online discussion. People don't understand, and fair enough, they haven't gone out and actually petitioned before. You have to have it on their form. It has to have their name, their address, their phone number, because the electoral officer is going to be confirming a bunch of these. So you can look at 10% of them might even get wiped out. So you got to get more than what the bar is. And you have 60 days to do it within. Now, again, we do want the bar high, but let's say it was set where you said at 50% plus one of those who came out to vote. And that turned out to be 4,000 official signatures. In a riding that's had that low a turnout, that's a good big bar. I mean, I'm sure somebody might go out and set out and start pounding the pavement thinking they could frivolously do it. Well, they can knock themselves out. If after 2 months, they'll be lucky to get 500. It is really hard. Somebody has to really cross the line before even that bar would be achieved. It's a reasonable one. Registering a party is one that you need the signatures of a certain percentage, and that one is the certain percentage of the people who came out in the last election.
Well, and importantly on that, so I know people who've tried to get signatures to register their own party. That is the worst way in Alberta to register a party. You just don't do it. It's very difficult because you need a huge number of signatures, and then you actually need about 20% more than is actually required, because Elections Alberta will say, well, we can't verify that this name matches this address, et cetera, or we couldn't make out the signature and verify it. there's a huge verification process. So about 20% are going to get thrown out. In reality, you're going to need the signatures of probably 50, 55 or 60% of the eligible voters in a constituency to actually get it done. And I should say something that in British Columbia, where they have similar legislation, with an actually slightly lower bar than us, because we've now got these extra steps in place, officially in BC, which has had this legislation for 20 odd years, not a single MLA has ever been officially recalled. There was one particular case where an MLA was found to be writing nasty letters against his political opponents in the local newspapers under a pseudonym, and he got busted. Apparently, he wasn't very smart. He used the same pseudonym for every one of his fake letters, so it was easy to match up all the nasty things he was saying.
Didn't need Sherlock Holmes there.
Yeah, and there, the recall petition campaign did get enough, and the MLA resigned halfway through the middle of the actual certification of the petition. So if he did get recalled, that is a recall.
It would have happened.
Yeah, it was inevitable. They had like 70% there. It was something nuts. But officially, he wasn't recalled. So effectively, in British Columbia's 20-odd years, only one MLA has been effectively recalled. So, and we have an even more difficult barrier to hit.
Yeah, well, you might not remember it to be before your time, but Dave Wood was the saga of Dar Hetherington. I brought her because she's one of those exceptional cases, and they're rare, but they do come up. And you really had to. It was the craziest of drama. For those who, I'll just quickly recap it. She was a city councilor in Lethbridge. She had suddenly surfaced, and I could be messing up the details. It's been a while, but in Las Vegas, she'd claimed that she'd been abducted and sexually assaulted. It turned out that she'd run off actually to join a gentleman that wasn't her husband. It was just very bizarre and strange. But the problem was they could not get her off city council, and she wasn't willing to leave. They had to keep her as their representative for a long time after this, when it was clear that she needed help. I mean, this was a person that seriously had some problems, but it did not belong on city council, and they couldn't do anything about it. That would be one of the situations where recall would be a consideration and a benefit to democracy.
Well, speaking of a benefit to democracy, John Winslow says he'd pay the $10,000 to change your name to Doris Day. So thank you, John Winslow.
Is the check in the mail?
Yeah. Is that to me or is that to the Standard?
Well, that's a good question. If you change your name, I'll forgo the $10,000 to the Standard. We'll go straight to you. We owe you money anyway, so
not that
we'll consider that back pay.
Let's work on this. Thanks, John. We might have to run it by Jane as well.
I think we should also touch on the Citizens Initiative side.
Yeah.
That's gotten a lot less attention. But maybe Dave, give us some primer on what's going on with that.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this previously. It's Jason Kenney realizes that he's in big trouble at the moment and wants to be seen doing things like the recall legislation and the Citizens Initiative and stuff like that. Whether it'll work and help turn their fortunes around, I'll leave that to you guys to argue about. But again, it may be too little, too late.
Well, I mean, just quickly on my own. I mean, I believe if the bar is achievable within reason. Again, it's got a tight window for petitioning, so that's debatable. But there's room to amend on these things too. This stuff isn't set yet, so that's part of why it's good to make noise.
Because governments are well known for allowing amendments to their bills.
Well, this government is getting pretty good at backtracking on a lot of stuff. So
they've got some angry backbenchers who might, like their own backbenchers, could attempt to amend this.
Yeah, so if they feel pressure the right way, I could see them conceivably changing some stuff to make it more palatable. One of the things that referenda does is takes the separation question out of his hands, because he could say that's up to the citizens now if they wanted to move towards an independence referendum. It's not the part of government, but we've given you the mechanism if there really was broad support.
Well, he's going to be able to claim that, but again, I think it's not reality because it's token. So there's kind of two big pieces to this. First of all, it's a very narrow window. You're never going to get the signatures for initiative referendum in Alberta. It's not happening. You need 10% of all eligible voters in Alberta, and there's like certain geographic requirements too that you can't just like canvass the hell out of one area. It's got to be represented through a certain number of constituencies. But you need 10% of the eligible voters in Alberta for a simple legislative or kind of motion non-binding referendum. So that's 10%. You're not going to get that. But here's the real kicker. If you want to have a referendum on an issue of constitutional nature, i.e. something like independence, or firewall, at least a lot of the firewall issues, you need 20%. Now, maybe a reader who's handy with Wikipedia can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know a single jurisdiction on the planet that has citizens initiative legislation with a bar of 20% for any issue. You will never, ever get 20% of every single eligible voter in Alberta signing a petition in such a short period of time. If the window was a year, maybe, but this is a very short window of time. But this is designed to allow JC. Originally, they were going to bar any constitutional issues in Citizens Initiative because they didn't want something like independence getting brought up. I think this is a smart political move. I don't think this is good policy, but I think it's a smart political move that Kenney has put. Yes, you can have a referendum on an issue of constitutional nature, like independence, but here's the bar I'm going to set. Good luck going out. Go spend all your effort collecting petitions rather than starting a political party to challenge power for it. So if the independence movement wanted to go with this, they would spend all of their effort getting signatures, which they're not going to get enough of in the time period. And it keeps them from spending their efforts on building a political party, the Alberta equivalent of, say, the PQ, to force a referendum. So I think it's a smart political move, but anyone who's hoping that Citizens Initiative is going to be your ticket to a referendum on independence, I'd encourage you to cool your enthusiasm.
Well, whether or not it's a smart political move depends on how voters respond to this. I mean, they see through this. The Albertans aren't as stupid as sometimes I think as our parties seem to think they are. That's how parties end up getting fired. They didn't need to reinvent the wheel with this. Switzerland's been doing this for over 100 years, and they do it very well, effectively. It's not frivolous referendums. They govern a lot of things based on it. We could have easily looked at their model, and implemented it here. So for them to set those bars that are above and beyond that does tell us they don't ever actually want them achieved, which is kind of insulting. So moving on into the, still on that democratic theme, another thing is holding your leaders accountable, especially if you're a party member or things like that. The old Wild Rose Constitution, again, getting back to them, used to have some pretty distinct mechanisms built in to where elected members could speak at certain intervals about whether or not they're satisfied with the leadership of the party at conventions and things like that. It looked like there was a move towards getting enough constituency associations together to have just such a thing like that happen this fall, and it appears Premier Kenney's headed that off. What happened there, Dave?
Well, the woes of Premier Kenney in the last 6 months have been well documented, from the Snowbird fiasco to the coal mining reversal to the Keystone Pipeline, $1 billion down the drain. Things have not been going well for Kenney. The last straw seems to have been the continuation of the lockdowns, where that caused a caucus revolt. Six of his UCP MLAs actually went public and said, "No, we've had enough. It's time to reopen." And ironically, they did that just a week later. The other thing, as you talked about, was the building the pressure within constituencies to hold a leadership review. So the UCP finally relented on the weekend and sent out an email saying, "Okay, we're going to have a leadership review of Premier Kenney. Hey, but guess what? It's only going to be 6 months before the next election." I mean, can you imagine that? Okay, we're going to turf Kenney, and we got 6 months to the next election. We have to hold a leadership convention, and then maybe we can get onto the campaign trail. As Mount Royal University political science professor Dwayne Bratt noted, it's just gamesmanship. Nobody is going to replace a leader with only 6 months to go. I think you just hit the nail on the head. Corey, Albertans will see through this, I think, and they're smart enough to say, "Well, yeah, you're offering it, but it's an olive branch that will never be taken."
What do you think?
You don't want to know what I think.
I got an idea.
Look, if I was advising Jason Kenney, if he wanted my advice and paid me to sit around him, I would advise him to do exactly this. The mechanism in the party's constitution to force a leadership review unscheduled through constituency associations, having them trigger it has the public appearance of recall. It means Kenney's being recalled as leader, essentially. His leadership review would not be a leadership review. It would be a recall election. I was like, are we recalling the leader? And simply having a recall election is a very bad look. It completely destroys their the moral authority of their leadership in the party. It would be open season. If he goes to that kind of leadership review where the constituency associations have demanded it, I think he would lose it. If it's a traditionally scheduled leadership review, the way most Democratic parties or even less Democratic parties operate, which is like, okay, every 2 conventions we're going to have a leadership review. That's what the Wild Rose had. Win government, win, lose, or draw. Every 2 conventions, there's a leadership review. They're scheduled, so it doesn't seem out of the ordinary. So I think it was not that I think it's a good thing what he did or ethical or whatever, but I think it was very smart politics. I think from a purely political play perspective, it was the right play. Takes it out of their hands. Kenney's belief is that he has never lost an election. I don't believe he thinks he can lose an election. So all he has to do is make it to the next election, and he will win. It doesn't matter that the UCP is way down in the polls. They're trailing the NDP. They've had a significant erosion of support on their right flank with Wild Rose. But he believes if he can make it to the next election, he'll get through. So what this essentially says is, okay, everybody, you're going to get your vote. In the meantime, shut up, fall behind, get behind the leader. You're just going to have to deal with it. But if anybody believes, like nobody believes that the party is going to turf him, unless he is an Alison Redford territory and popularity, there's just no way they're going to turf him. And it also allows him to get, it's generally accepted wisdom that you need to get a bare minimum of 66 to 68% in a leadership review to still have the authority to lead a political party into the next election. If he gets below that, he will be able to say, well, I would have liked more, but we're so close to an election, we can't afford to change the leader. And he could continue on with a bare majority of 50% plus 1.
What did Ralph Klein get? I think he got 75, didn't he?
No, he said he needed 75.
61 or something.
Or 55 or something. It was pretty low. A leader cannot, like Ralph Klein could not stay on with the level of support that he had. Everybody was shocked about it. But most leaders resign if they are lower than the mid-60s. You clearly don't have the authority to do it. I think there's only been 2 leaders that I'm aware of, at least in Canadian history, who have actually lost a leadership review, like outright lost, who got less than 50%. That was John Diefenbaker, for who the leadership review process was literally created for, because the party wanted to get rid of him. He was just not going away. And the other one was Thomas Mulcair, who outright lost. Those are the only 2. Again, I'm sure there's a nerd somewhere who can poke a hole in my argument, but those are the only 2 I'm aware of who have outright lost. But a lot of leaders will get in the mid-60s or below, but still get a majority, but they know that you don't have the authority to lead a party. If you can't command virtually everybody in the party to back you, you can't be the leader. So it's a smart move. I'm telling you right now, he is probably going to make it to the election. There's a chance that there'll be a caucus revolt, but I don't think it's happening. Anybody who's holding out hopes that you can get rid of him, I don't think it's going to work. I'll put $20 right down now to anyone else on the panel. 2-to-1 odds. Jason Kenney is going to lead the UCP into the next election. I will not bet. I will not give you good odds on if he wins that election or not, though.
Yeah, well, I wasn't eager. I mean, I've been very critical of the UCP and Premier Kenney lately, but I wasn't eager to see it tear itself apart this fall or possibly have a leadership review ripping out its leader, halfway through a mandate. I mean, what I want to see is them to find their bloody feet and start leading, like as a party, as a premier, so that you don't face these threats. Now, though, to see it put off just due to political brinksmanship rather than changing their path or policy tells me they might not have learned from this yet. So there could be a lot of trouble coming yet.
I think so. And before we go, I should also mention, we should have Alexander on one day. A lot of the stories we're talking about today were from our reporter in Edmonton, Alexander Dollywall. He's been doing a lot of great work. He reports to you, Dave. Maybe we'll get him on the pipeline now since he's working well. And I know he's watching because he's responding to some people. They're asking questions and he's providing links to stories. So we know you're watching.
He's
Alex.
That nerd you were talking about.
He is the nerd.
Yeah. Sorry, Alex. We know you're not a nerd.
Well, in closing, that's that reminder. You know, Alexander's putting some great content on the site. You want to see the details of what we're talking about, get out there, get that subscription, subscribe to the YouTube channel. That way you see those live specials, because Danielle Smith's coming on again tomorrow night with the legal team. They've been working with, you know, Pastor Coates to get him free, and they've also been doing a lot of work with people charged under things with the restrictions.
A bunch of the lawyers who are working with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. The president of that's John Carpe. We've already had him on the show before with Danielle Smith. Dave's probably done freaking 24 interviews or more with him in the last few months. But yeah, we're having a bunch of the lawyers from the JCCF on. These are the lawyers who are fighting the lockdown. Danielle Smith will be interviewing them. It's going to be a great show.
Yeah, and I know it makes some people cringe thinking of listening to a bunch of lawyers for a long time, but with Danielle in there to make sure that they're talking about things that are important.
They've listened to us for a long time.
Yeah, I know. I can't believe they're hanging in there. So I'll let people go. I thank you very much for viewing. I'm Corey Morgan, soon to possibly be Doris Day with Derek and Dave. We'll see what my name is next week.
John Winslow, we have your name. We actually know where you live, so we will come to collect.
Okay, thanks. We'll see you all next week.
Cheers.